All right, so here's what we're going to do. I was just telling Hannah that essentially how we're going to handle this today, right, is I'll give you some context for Greek rhetoric generally. We'll talk a little bit about the Plato, and then I will have you guys watch a video recording of my other class's discussion of the Aristotle so that everybody's caught up on everything. For next time, you're going to be reading John Quincy Adams' Eloquence is the Child of Liberty. Which is just as exciting as it sounds. And you'll remember that Exploratory Reflection 2 is due tonight, right? So does anybody have any questions about the assignment before?
It wasn't due Monday?
I thought it was due Monday.
Oh my God. Yeah.
On the board it said it was due Monday.
Was it due Monday?
Yes.
If you've already done it. Then.
Oh my God.
We were stressing about
Yes,
it.
I could have been doing other stuff, like studying.
Well, think of it like, if you've already done it, it's done.
Right. Yeah, this is done.
What if we want to revise it before tonight?
Can you look at it for us and then?
Tell you what, if you want to revise it and resubmit it, that's fine. I'll have a look at it.
Okay.
And yeah, if you want to revise and resubmit, that'll be okay.
Because I don't know if this is right, but what I did was I took what I wrote for, how you say something, whatever his name is.
Sun Tzu?
Yeah. And what I did for the other paper, and I took that and I added it to my paper, but then I added education on top of that.
That's not really quite what I wanted you to do. I did want you to kind of to start from a new basis, right? So instead of revising the old paper. So if you do still want to work on Sun Tzu, I want you to kind of to make sure that your focus is on the Sun Tzu reading from this unit, not from the past one. Right?
Well, what was the one from this reading?
The one from the previous unit was the one about man's nature being evil, and then this one was about encouraging learning was the title of it.
Is it in the book then?
Yeah. It's
Okay.
yeah. In fact, I think it's actually the very first thing in the book. Page 3. Yep.
Okay. Then I guess we were looking at the wrong one.
Okay, what I did was I just recapped. Because I feel like I couldn't talk about Sun Tzu if I didn't tell them, tell you
Sure.
his opinions on, his ideas on
Human nature. Okay,
so I
sure.
just recapped that in the intro, and then
Yeah.
I just.
And that's fine. If you want to recap those ideas in the introduction, because his idea of education does stem from his idea of human nature, that's totally okay, right? But you got to make sure the focus is on the education essay, not on the human nature essay.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's what I did. I focused more on education, but I also took points from like my other one and put it in there about nature, like human nature, from his point of view. We have different things, I swear.
Yeah. No, I believe you.
I was like, what are you doing? She's like, I'm doing so. I was like, oh, me too.
But so is yours mainly on thought and study with Sun Tzu? I did mine on like environment and education.
Okay.
Because I wanted it to differ.
Sure. Yeah, and yeah, I think, and that's, yeah. You got to make sure that what your focus is on is the education essay, not the human
I
nature
kind of
essay.
touched on everything you were saying, like environment and thought versus study and what was the other one? Oh, conscious activity. I kind of focused on all three, like a little bit of.
Okay. What you probably want to do is sort of choose a more singular focus, right? Choose particular aspects of his argument to pick apart. And that, like, I'll look at what you've got and I'll make suggestions. And I'll do that when we're done here, so that you have them, so you have that early. Okay. So, did both of you take Comp 1 here? You did not. Serenity, did you?
Mm-hmm.
You did? Okay. So, did you talk at all about rhetoric in Comp 1?
We talked about the Aristotle and Plato, but
Okay.
I can't remember too
Okay.
much.
So you did talk about Aristotle and Plato in terms of rhetoric. Okay. So this isn't going to be completely new territory for everybody. But do you have any familiarity with this stuff at all?
I mostly did like essays about, like she gives a topic to write about, hand write about, or like argumentative essays, like on
Okay, and where did you take Comp 1 out of curiosity?
I was looking at Columbus Tech.
Okay. So yeah,
That lady hated me with a passion no matter what I did.
the focus is often a little different in the technical college system than in the university system. So yeah, what we're going to be talking about today specifically is what rhetoric is, what it means, and sort of how it develops historically from a particular set of circumstances in ancient Greece, right? So what does the word rhetoric mean? Like, do you guys have any concept of what the word is or what we're talking about? We're talking about rhetoric.
I don't know the devices that you use.
Okay, like what?
You have like your metaphors and your similes, and then you have like your shoot.
Okay, so when you're talking about what we call rhetorical tropes, right? So
Yeah.
these rhetorical formulas that we use for particular effects, right?
That's all we had to do last year when I was in the junior class was rhetorical devices.
Okay. So what's the point of using those devices? What are you aiming to do with rhetoric? What is the purpose of rhetoric? What are you trying to do if you're using rhetoric?
We had to like dig deeper because like with syntax order, that's one I remember. You have to like every period, every pause like has a meaning, so you have to try to find a deeper meaning of what the author is trying to say.
Okay.
Persuade.
Yeah, what you're doing when you're using rhetoric is you're trying to persuade someone of something, right? You're using usually language to try to persuade someone to adopt a particular point of view or course of action. So rhetoric is usually defined as, the study or the art of persuasion, right?
So then she told us wrong. And she was like, every pause, every period, every dash has a meaning. And I was like, okay.
Well, and that's not necessarily incorrect, right? People do pause for particular rhetorical effects, right? But it's certainly not the whole of what we're talking about here. So when we talk about rhetoric, what we're talking about is basically any means that people use to try to persuade you of something. So the places we most frequently encounter it in our day-to-day lives are in advertising, right, where people are trying to get you to buy shit that you don't need, and in political rhetoric, right, where people are trying to get you to either support or donate to a particular candidate or a particular party or to, adopt a particular course of action, right? So if we think about how this works in advertising, can we remember early in the semester when we watched those two McDonald's ads? Do you remember those two advertisements? There was the one with the little kid singing the song about their teacher and the other one in the nightclub.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back to that for a second if we can, right? And think about the means of persuasion that were being used in those two ads. Right, so let's think first about the first ad with the little kids, right? Do we remember anything in particular about their song? Like what sorts of words they were using to describe their teacher and why they valued their teacher? Hard-nosed Mrs. Hatcher, tough as you can get.
Did they like not like the teacher and then they ended up like loving them?
Yeah. To get, when things got tough, she made us stick to it, right? She pushed and pushed and pushed. So there's this language embedded in the ad about hard work, right? And the ad takes place in a suburban school, and mostly features little kids, right? So the basic idea here, the basic thing they're trying to get, the thing they want you to do is buy a goddamn hamburger, right? That's the basic pitch. But they're trying to do so by appealing to our sense of traditional values, right? Things like family and hard work and obedience to authority, right? So they are suggesting that McDonald's supports all of these things, right? Now, what about the other ad? What do you remember about the other ad, apart from the music being much, much better? What was the setting for the other ad that we looked at?
You said like a nightclub.
Yeah, it's a McDonald's, right? But it's a McCafe. It's more like a nightclub coffee house. And what was different about the product they're trying to sell you?
Coffee.
Yeah, they're trying to sell you coffee, right, rather than a burger.
It's more like geared toward like young adults.
Yeah, in fact, the entire cast is young, good-looking adults, right? Mostly young couples sitting together at tables. No kids anywhere to be seen, right? And how is McDonald's trying to sell, like, what kind of image are they trying to sell you in that ad that's different from what they were doing in the earlier ad? What do they want you to believe about McDonald's by giving you this nightclub setting full of cool, good-looking people?
That is cool.
Yeah, that McDonald's is cool, right? I know, it's a tough sell, right? You know, we still associate it with Playland and ball pits and, you know, and cartoon clowns and, you know, little gritty burgers. And, you know, does anybody know what it, like, it seems like these people are being encouraged to sit and linger, right? Does anybody know what actually happens in a McDonald's if you linger too long?
No, but I'm scared to find out.
Well, yeah, right, yeah. Because they don't want you sitting there too long, right? They want you to eat and leave. But yeah, they're trying to encourage you to believe, using this different imaging, right, that McDonald's is cool and inclusive, right? Now, how the hell is the eraser?
Didn't they change the McDonald's down here to Meat Cafe? That's the name of it now.
Well, certainly it's the name. It's the name they put on the coffees. I think they may have changed some of their restaurants, especially in some cities, over to McCafes. Yeah, I think, you know, like if you go, you know, over to the McDonald's at Perry Brothers on 19 here, right? It's still same old traditional McDonald's, right? With a gas station included the boot. So, hold that thought for a second. I need to find an eraser. Is there not one in this room? Apparently there is not.
You can't use a red.
Yeah, I'm just gonna use a rag. Don't know why that didn't occur to me.
Are those your own rags?
These are my own, yeah, I take them home and wash them. Well, that way I'm not throwing out a bunch of paper. And I'm wasting water but saving trees. So, you know, 6 of one, half dozen the other there. Now, when we think about political rhetoric, right, there are a couple ways we can approach this. One way we can think about this is through things like word choice, right? So, for example, if we think about the 2016 election, let's not be partisan here. Let's just focus for a second on the Democratic primary, right? So there was an analysis done of the pronoun use of the two leading Democratic candidates, right? In particular, like the way they use the first person pronoun. And the analysis found that Hillary Clinton used the word I much more often, and that Bernie Sanders used the word we much more often. Now, if we're talking about a primary in a presidential election, what are each of these candidates trying to convince you of? What are they trying to persuade you of?
To vote them into office.
Yeah, that they should be president, right? So how does pronoun use indicate a different kind of pitch?
Bernie's is more inclusive.
Okay, yeah. It suggests a different, like an idea of the presidency that is inclusive, right? Where the president is doing the will of the people, right? Right. Whether that is how he actually would have governed or not, right? The idea is to try to convince people that you're one of them, right? And that you're doing their work. Now, why would Hillary Clinton use I instead? What kind of vision of the presidency is she suggesting there?
She's going to lead people the way that she wants to do that.
Yeah, president more as kind of like leader or executive, right?
I'm not going to say like a dictator, but that's kind of what it came to mind.
What's that?
That's not going to say a dictator, but that's kind of what came to mind.
Well, and I don't think, like, yeah, I mean, let's go with leader or executive, right? But yeah, I mean, like, essentially, like, treating it as almost like a job interview for a CEO, right? This is what I've done. This is what I've done. This is how I am qualified. This is what I would do in office, right? So, you know, there are other ways you can frame this around, so, you know, like gender expectations and things like that as well, right? That, you know, different expectations are placed on Sanders as a man and Clinton as a woman, right? Which might also affect how they frame their arguments, right? But I'm just talking about word choice and the basic pitch, right? Now, word choice is important, so are things like tone. Have either of you been watching the presidential debates this time around? Ish. Yeah, I watched bits of the first one and I watched the last one. So again, without getting into any kind of partisan issues here, right? Let's just kind of look at the speaking styles of the two leading candidates, right? If we look at Joe Biden and Donald Trump and the way they present themselves.
I'm kind of giving up on the 2020 presidents because I'm older right by now.
I think we all. I think most of us are a little
Over
exhausted.
2020 in general.
But remember that, like, one of the best reasons to study rhetoric, right, is to understand how people are trying to persuade you of things, right, and to improve your bullshit detector as a result.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk first about Joe Biden. What is Biden's speaking style like? In terms of tone, in terms of word choices? Yeah, go ahead.
Calm.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
like he's careful with what he says.
Calm, yeah. He always comes off as careful, in part because he does speak slowly, right?
I just kind of like cautious, like he thinks about what he says before he says it.
Yeah, and some of that is because he does have a speech disorder. He stutters, and so he speaks slowly to control that, right? But yeah, it comes, calm, careful, slow, right? And what kind of image might one be trying to project if you're speaking calmly, carefully, and slowly when you're in public?
Compared to the yelling, angry balloons next to him, he's like somebody you want to have leading. Like he's calm under pressure.
Okay, yeah, somebody who shows grace under fire, right? Who is going to be stable, right? Not exciting, but stable, right? Okay, and I think that it's probably fairly obvious how most of us feel about the other candidates. But what is his speaking style like?
Loud, angry.
Okay, yeah.
Defensive.
Yeah, loud, defensive.
Kind of like forceful. I'm gonna throw a word.
Yeah, forceful or aggressive, right? He gets in people's faces. He interrupts frequently, right?
Yeah.
In fact, that was, I don't know, if either of you watched the first debate, but, essentially, like, it was just, two old men interrupting each other, one much more than the other. If you remember the 2016 debates at all, he spent much of the time kind of following Hillary Clinton around the stage, right? Even even when he wasn't talking, like physically following her. So, what kind of president is he trying? Let's imagine that there is actually a method to this, and that it's not just random, right? How is he trying to present himself to the electorate? What does he want voters to think of him if this is how he speaks?
I don't even know.
Well, if he's loud and aggressive, right?
He's like the most laid back control freak I have ever seen, because like he wants things done his way, but he doesn't do things about it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I get.
Yeah. And I mean, and we're not even talking about governing style here right now. We're just sort of talking about style of presentation, right? As
Look
means
at
of
that, like, he's
persuasion.
like kind of like a laid back control freak. That's kind of like stuff.
Yeah, and he does sort of seem to need to be in control of the situation all the time, right? And I think that's part of what is going on here with the very aggressive rhetorical behavior, right? Is he's trying to make sure he's in control of the narrative all the time, right? But I think at least the most positive spin that I can put on it, without wading into the partisan waters, because again, like I'm a public employee, right, and I have to behave myself here. He's trying to present himself as someone who's a fighter, right? And the idea is that someone who is willing to fight and to be aggressive is someone who is going to fight on your behalf, right? Who will be aggressive for you if they get into office. Again, whether or not that's actually true, you look at some of these records to make that bear out, right? But again, like rhetoric and truth don't always correlate perfectly with each other, right? Persuasion and truth don't always match up. And we run across this stuff even in our day-to-day conversations with one another. Like, for example, I didn't put it up today, but if we look at what I put up on the board at the beginning of pretty much every class, right? Please put away in silence all personal electronics. Thanks. How am I trying to persuade you to do this? I could just tell you to do it, right?
Yeah, but
And
you're
because
being kind of polite about it. You're not being like bossy about it.
yeah, I'm being polite, right? I'm saying please, and please do this, and thank you, assuming that you do it, right? I could just tell you to do it. I don't. Why would I care about being polite or framing this politely rather than simply telling you to do it? If I frame it as a polite request, what's the difference?
I feel like if you're telling us to do it, or not that we would do this, but like we're more likely to rebel and like not do it.
Yeah, if I just tell you to do it, if I make it into a command, it's more likely to piss you off, right?
And then like not us, but in general, yes.
You're more likely to be irritated by it, right? Plus, like, where does, if I frame it this way, is it me telling you to do it, or is it me asking you to do so and you choosing to comply? Either way, I'm still telling you to do it, right? Because you know that I expect you to do it, right? And if you don't comply, I will tell you to do it. But at least this presents the illusion of choice for you. It makes it feel like or sound like it's your choice to obey,
But when it's really
even if it really isn't, right? And you're more likely to comply if you feel like you're doing so voluntarily, rather than being told to. So see, words are tricky, right? Language is tricky. Language is slippery. And it can be used to do all kinds of things, some of which are morally dodgy. Which again is, one more reason why it's better for us to know all this stuff. So, modern rhetoric arises out of a particular set of circumstances in 5th century BCE Athens, right? It's inaccurate to say ancient Greece, because one thing you have to remember about ancient Greece is we had individual city-states that were not, they spoke the same language, had the same religion, the similar culture, but they had their own government structures, right? So, the way things were in Sparta was not the way things were in Athens, was not the way things were in Corinth, and so on and so forth, right? So what do we know about 5th century Athens, about government there? I think we've talked about this before. Yes. It was a democracy. And how did Athenian democracy work that's, say, different from the way our democracy works? How does our democracy work? Do we directly assemble to decide on matters of civic importance?
No, we have representatives.
Yeah, we vote for representatives to do that, right? At pretty much all levels of government, right? We have the right to go to, say, city council meetings and things like that, right? School board meetings, whatever. But by and large, we elect representatives who are supposed to air our concerns in whatever form we elect them to, right? Ancient Greek democracy didn't work that way. It was a direct democracy. All male adult citizens who were not slaves were permitted to vote on matters of civic importance, right? So there were no official elected leaders, although people might be elected to a position like general or state physician or something like that, right? But everybody's vote carried exactly the same weight. Now, why might persuasion, in particular, a field of study devoted to persuasion, be particularly useful in this kind of government situation? If you want to get anything done in, say, a dictatorship, who do you have to convince? Yeah, just one person, right? The dictator or somebody who has the dictator's ear, right?
What if you had the person in power, basically?
What's that?
Like you'd have to convince the
Yeah,
person in power.
you would have to convince the person in power, right? Probably just one person, right? If you want to get something done in a direct democracy,
You have to convince the people.
yeah, you have to convince a majority of the people, right? So, what happened was these itinerant teachers of rhetoric called Sophists most of whom were foreign-born. Very few of them were actually native to Athens. Hire themselves out to aristocratic families to teach their sons rhetoric, right? To teach their sons the art of persuasion, of swaying the multitudes, right? So, sophist comes from the Greek word sophia, which means wisdom. And sophist translates to something like wise one. So the sophists held that absolute truth was unknowable. Right? If there was any kind of central, ultimate, absolute truth, there was no way for human beings to know what it was. So the best thing we could do was try to approximate truth by constructing good arguments. So they were essentially, they were what we would call today relativists. Do you guys know what a relativist is or what relativism means? Okay, so a relativist is someone who believes that truth is entirely dependent on perspective. Right? That whether or not something is good or true depends on where you stand in relation to it. So this is a term that's often used, for example, in anthropology, cultural relativism, right? The idea that you have to judge a culture by its own standards and not by yours, right? You know, determining things about that particular culture. So the way the sophists taught, right? They tended to teach verbal eloquence how to manage and modulate your vocal tone for particular effects. They taught literary criticism, and they also taught the effective use of gestures, right? One of these things is not quite like the others, right? The literary criticism may kind of seem like an odd fit, but part of the reason they wanted their students to have a broad literary knowledge was so that they could make effective allusions to familiar pieces of literature, right? So you could appeal to an audience by quoting, from Homer or Hesiod or one of the great Greek poets that, everybody at the time would have known, right? So, the best known of the sophists were Gorgias, Protagoras, and Isocrates, not to be confused with Socrates. Right? This is Socrates with an I, different guy. Most of whom did write treatises on rhetoric that are now lost. So most of what we know about the sophists comes from things that their enemies said about them. So we should take a lot of Socrates' argument with Gorgias here with a grain of salt. Because Plato, Socrates' student, who uses Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas, was very much opposed to the ideas of the sophists. So, Plato's basic position is that there is absolute truth. Actually, we should capitalize the A and the T here. And it can be discovered through back and forth discussion. Or what the Greeks call dialectic. So that's why Plato's writings are always framed as a dialogue, right? Because this truth comes out of conversation, or it comes out usually of Socrates' aggressive needling of an opponent, right? Socrates made himself very, very unpopular in Athens by going around to powerful and important people and asking them lots of questions that made them look stupid. And so eventually, the elders of Athens voted for Socrates to be executed. Ostensibly because he was a corrupter of the youth, but mostly probably because he was a massive pain in the ass. So Plato believes that there is absolute truth can be discovered through back and forth discussion. And he opposes the idea of philosophy, right? Philosopher translates to lover of wisdom, to the idea of the sophist or wise one. Now, how is this bit of rhetorical framing different, right? How is it different to call yourself a philosopher or than it is to call yourself a sophist, right? What's the difference here? Just in terms of language.
What do you say? Lover of wisdom.
Yeah.
I think that one actually is wise and one kind of
Yeah.
wants to be wise.
It
I have a
loves
good
wisdom, but
appreciation
it's
of
not
that.
wise.
Yeah, so the philosopher presents himself as aspirational, right? As someone who doesn't have all the answers, right? But wants to learn. While the sophist presents himself as someone who does have the answers and already knows things, right? So some of it is kind of like about humility. That the philosopher recognizes what he doesn't know, and the sophist claims simply to know, right? So let's look at the Gorgias here and see how Plato makes his arguments against rhetoric and against, in particular, the rhetoric of the sophists. So, conveniently, this is a dialogue and there are two of you. So, Hannah, you be Gorgias, and Serenity, you be Socrates. And we start on page 122. Serenity, can you start with, what are we to call you and what is the art which we profess?
What are we to call you, and what is the art which you profess?
You say it's rhetoric?
Yes,
I always thought it was rhetoric.
no, rhetoric.
Rhetoric, Socrates, is my art.
Then I am to call you a rhetorician.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Socrates, and a good one too. If you call me that which, in Homer's language, I boast myself to be,
I should wish to do so.
then pray do.
And are we to say that you are able to make other men rhetoricians?
Yes, that's exactly what I profess to make them, not only in Athens, but in all places.
And will you continue to ask and answer questions, Gorgias, as we are to present, doing, and reserve for another occasion the longer mode of speech which Polus was attempting? Will you keep your promise and answer shortly the questions which are asked of you?
Some answers, Socrates, are of necessity longer, but I will do my best to make them as short as possible, for part of my profession is that I can be short as anyone.
That is what is wanted, Gorgias. Exhibit the shorter method now and the longer one at some other time.
Well, I will, and you will certainly say that you never heard a man use fewer words.
Very good then. As you profess to be a rhetorician and a maker of rhetoricians, let me ask you, with what is rhetoric concerned? I might ask with what is weaving concerned, and you would reply, would you not? With the making of garments?
Yes,
And music is concerned with the composition of melodies?
it is.
By here, Gorgias, I admire the surpassing brevity of your answers.
Yes, Socrates, I do think myself good at that.
I am glad to hear it. Answer me in like manner about rhetoric. With what is rhetoric concerned?
With discourse.
What sort of discourse, Gorgias? Such discourse as would teach the sick under what treatment they might get
Okay,
well.
pause here for a second, right? So what does Gorgias say rhetoric is concerned with? What is his art? How would he define it? Pardon?
That, rhetoric is art.
Yeah, but with what is rhetoric concerned?
Discourse.
Homer, then?
With discourse, yes.
What do you mean by I boast myself to be?
Pardon?
Or he says like I boast myself to be, like what does that mean?
Let's see. Yes, and Socrates, a good one too. If you would call me that which in Homeric language I boast myself to be. So, boast here is a strong way of saying claim, right? And yes, I am a rhetorician if I am what I claim to be, right? But yeah, boasting we associate with bragging, right? But the bigger point, actually, the reason why that matters is that he is making an allusion to the poet Homer, right? So he is showing off his literary skill and knowledge, right? The way he can weave literary references into his discourse, right? So rhetoric is that which is concerned with discourse, right? And then to continue, Socrates, what sort of discourse?
Oh, okay. What sort of discourse, Gorgias? Such discourse as would teach the sick under what treatment they might get well.
No.
The rhetoric does not treat of all kinds of discourse,
Certainly not.
and yet rhetoric makes men able to speak
Yes.
and to understand that about which they speak.
Of course.
But does not the art of medicine, which we were just now mentioning, also make men able to understand and speak about the sick?
Certainly.
The medicine also treats of discourse
Yes.
concerning diseases?
Just so.
And does not gymnastic also treat of discourse concerning the good or evil condition of the body?
Very true.
And the same, Gorgias, is true of the other arts. All of them treat of discourse concerning the subjects with which they severally have to do.
Clearly.
Then why, if you call rhetoric the art which treats of discourse, and all the other arts treat of discourse, do you not call them arts of rhetoric?
Okay, so what is Socrates trying to point out about Gorgias's initial definition of rhetoric as being the art that's concerned with discourse?
How is it the art of discourse when all the other arts
Yeah.
are?
That's how you apply to discourse.
Yeah, it's like, okay, well, there's discourse in medicine too, right? There's discourse in gymnastics, there's discourse in all of these other fields, right? What is special about rhetoric, right? Don't all fields use discourse? And Gorgias's response.
Oh, hold on. Because Socrates, the knowledge of the other arts has only to do with some of the external action, as of the hand. For there is no such action of the hand in rhetoric which works and takes effect only through the medium of discourse. And therefore I am justified in saying that rhetoric treats of discourse.
I'm not sure whether I entirely understand you,
Neither am I.
but I dare say I shall soon know better. Please to answer me a question. You would allow that there are arts?
Yes.
And as to the arts generally, they are for the most part concerned with doing and require little or no speaking. In painting, in statuary, and many other arts, the work may proceed in silence. And of such arts, I suppose you would say that they do not come within the province of rhetoric.
You perfectly conceive my meaning, Socrates.
But there are other arts which work wholly through the medium of language and require either no action or very little, as for example the arts of arithmetic, or of calculation, of geometry, and of playing draughts. And some of these speech is pretty nearly coextensive with action, but in most of them the verbal element is greater. They depend wholly on words for their efficacy and power. And I take your meaning to be that rhetoric is an art of this latter sort.
Exactly.
And yet I do not believe that you really mean to call any of these arts rhetoric, although the precise... Okay, my thing cut off, so...
Well, the precise expression which you used was that rhetoric is an art which works and takes effect only through the medium of discourse. And an adversary who wished to be captious might say, and so, Gorgias, you call arithmetic rhetoric. But I do not think that you really call arithmetic rhetoric any more than geometry would be so called by you.
You're quite right, Socrates, in your apprehension of my meaning.
Well, then, let me now have the rest of my answer. Seeing that rhetoric is one of those arts which works mainly by the use of words, and there are other arts which also use words, tell me what is the quality in words with which rhetoric is concerned. Suppose that a person asked me about some of the arts which I was mentioning just now. He might say, Socrates, what is arithmetic? And I should reply to him, as you reply to me, that arithmetic is one of those arts which would take effect through words. And then he would proceed to ask me, words about what? And I should reply, words about odd and even numbers. Now how many there are of each? And he asked again, what is the art of calculation? And I should say, that also is one of the arts which is concerned wholly with words. And if he further said, concerned with what? I should say, like the clerks in the assembly, as aforesaid of arithmetic, but with the difference. The difference being that the art of calculation considers not only the quantities of odd and even numbers, but also their numerical relations to themselves and to one another. And suppose, again, I was to say that astronomy is only words. He will ask, words about what, Socrates? And I should answer that astronomy tells us about the motions of the stars and the sun and the moon and their relative swiftness.
Okay, so what is the question Socrates is trying to ask him? Why does he come up with these other examples, arithmetic, calculation, astronomy? What does he want Gorgias to tell him? What does he want to know from Gorgias?
What does he mean that rhetoric is concerned with words? Well, how is rhetoric your art? And how do I explain this?
I try to get them to find out what is the importance of rhetoric, and it's not just to one specific thing, but it can simply go like everything.
It's concerned with words, but what if somebody else were to ask me about this art, and I would say it's concerned with words?
Yeah.
And they would continuously ask me
words about what?
Yeah.
Because it can be in many forms. It doesn't have to be physical words.
Yeah, well, I think what he's pointing out here is that these arts like astronomy, right? Okay, we can associate astronomy with a particular class of words, right? The motions of the planets and, information about the stars, things like that, right? What Socrates is asking is the content of rhetoric, right? What are these words about? Right? What is rhetorical discourse concerned with? And we see after this that Gorgias kind of puts off the question a little bit, right? What's concerned with the greatest of things. And he gets a little dodgy for a little bit, right? Probably, again, for rhetorical effect, so that when he makes his big reveal, it seems more important, right? It seems more impressive. Right? Socrates asks him on page 125, right? He gives these examples of the physician, the trainer, and the moneymaker, who will all say their art is the greatest, right? If you ask the physician what art is the greatest, they'll say, oh, well, medicine, making people well, right? If you ask the trainer, well, keeping people fit and healthy, that's, gymnastic, that's what's best. The moneymaker, the businessman, will say, well, creating wealth is what's best. And Socrates' response is, okay, so if someone were to ask you, Gorgias, what is best, right? What is this greatest art, this greatest secret, right? What would you tell them? That good, Socrates, which is truly the greatest, being that which gives to men freedom in their own persons, and to individuals the power of ruling over others in their several states. And what would you consider this to be? Right? You can almost feel Socrates getting frustrated with Gorgias at this point, right? What is there greater than the word which persuades the judges in the courts, or the senators in the council, or the citizens in the assembly, or at any other political meeting? If you have the power of uttering this word, you will have the physician your slave, and the trainer your slave, and the moneymaker of whom you talk will be found to gather treasures not for himself, but for you who are able to speak and to persuade the multitude. Now I think, Gorgias, that you have very accurately explained what you conceive to be the art of rhetoric. And you mean to say, if I am not mistaken, that rhetoric is the artificer of persuasion, having this and no other business, and that this is her crown and end. Do you know any other effect of rhetoric above and beyond that of producing persuasion? No. The definition seems to me very fair, Socrates. For persuasion is the chief end of rhetoric. Okay, so we arrive here at a definition, finally, that the two of them agree on, right? That rhetoric is concerned exclusively with persuasive discourse. And now we get into arguments about whether this is good or bad, right? So, where I'd like to take this now is where Gorgias explains the power of his art. Right? So can we turn to page 128? And can we start with Gorgias? And will you observe, Socrates, that when a decision has to be given in such matters?
And you observe, Socrates, that when a decision has to be given in such matters that you did that so good, I can't say the word. Are the advisors that are the men who win their point.
And I had that in my admiring mind, Gorgias, when I asked what is the nature of rhetoric, which always appears to me, when I look at the matter in this way, to be a marvel of greatness.
Admirable indeed, Socrates, if you only knew how rhetoric comprehends and holds under her sway all the inferior arts. Let me offer you a striking example of this. On several occasions I have been with my brother,
Herodotus.
Or some other physician to see one of his patients who would not allow the physician to give him medicine, or apply a knife or a hot iron to him. And I have persuaded him to do for me what he would not do for the physician, just by the use of rhetoric. And I say that if a rhetorician,
Close enough.
and a physician were to go to any city and have there to be an argue in the place,
The ecclesia, yeah.
or any other assembly as to which of them should be elected state physician, the physician would have no chance. But he can speak but he who could speak would be chosen if he wished. And in the contest with a man of any other profession, the rhetorician more than anyone would have the power of getting himself chosen, for he can speak more persuasively to the multitude of men, to the multitude. I can't talk to it.
It's okay.
I'm trying to go too fast. Can speak more persuasively to the multitude than any of them, and on any subject. Such is nature and power of the art of rhetoric.
Okay, can pause there, right? So, what points here is Gorgias making about rhetoric? What two related ideas is he talking about? What's his first example of the power of rhetoric here?
The physician and his brother.
Yeah, my brother's a doctor, right? Sometimes his patients refuse to take their medicine or submit to surgery or whatever, like even if it's good for them.
So you think his brother was a physician?
Yeah, his brother's the physician,
Oh, okay.
right? And he goes along sometimes with his brother on visits to patients to convince people to take their medicine, right? Because his brother isn't a rhetorician and isn't skilled in speaking the way Gorgias is, right?
What are they talking about with the knife and the hot iron? Didn't back in the day when you got sick, they bled you out to try to get rid of the virus or whatever?
Yeah, some of that is trying to balance out your humors, right? Which basically means draining your body of certain liquids to produce harm. So it's we would now recognize as quackery, right? It's not something that's legitimate medical treatment anymore. But yeah, they would do things like bleed people out. Or even the knife or the hot iron could just refer to surgical techniques. So the hot iron is probably to cauterize a wound so it doesn't get infected, right? Because one thing that we do have to remember, one of the reasons why our lifespans on average are so much longer than those of many of our ancestors is because prior to antibiotics, a lot of people died of simple infection, right? You cut your thumb and it gets infected, right? Dig a plot, right? Not always, but frequently enough. It's if you got a bad enough infection, you were not going to recover it. You would die. So cauterization with a hot iron is one way you prevented a wound from getting infected, right? Because you close it up right away with the hot iron. It hurts, right? It hurts like hell, but it's that or infection. So in that case, Gorgias is actually doing something that is good, right? He is convincing people to take their medicine when they don't want to. What's the other situation he describes here? You've got two candidates in the public assembly who want to be state physician, right? The physician, the actual physician, and the rhetorician, right? Now, which one of these, on merit, should get the post of state physician?
The physician.
Yeah, the actual fucking doctor should have the job, right? But who is Gorgias saying will get the position?
The rhetorician.
Yeah, because he's able to talk people into voting for him, right? So we see here uses of this art that are both positive and negative here, right? And I don't think that Gorgias intended the second as a negative example, or is it supposed to have intended the second as a negative example?
So he's basically contradicting himself?
Yeah, well, he's trying to show the power of his art, right? See, I can be completely unqualified to be state physician, but because I'm a good speaker, I could still convince people to vote for me. And that's kind of mind-boggling, right?
Yeah.
Although, I think, we also can probably note from observing our own political culture that this is also true, right? The most qualified person doesn't always win elections, in part because sometimes they have a harder time reaching or connecting to the audience. But yeah, so what Gorgias is saying is you don't actually have to know anything about medicine to become state physician. You just have to be a good speaker. Right? So a good speaker can convince people of anything. And yet, Socrates, rhetoric should be used like any other competitive art, not against everybody. The rhetorician ought not to abuse his strength any more than a pugilist or a pancratiatist or other master of fence, because he has powers which are more than a match, either for friend or enemy. He ought not therefore to strike, stab, or slay his friends. Suppose a man who had been trained in the palestra to be a skillful boxer. He, in the fullness of his strength, goes and strikes his father or mother or one of his familiars or friends. But that is no reason why the trainers or fencing masters should be held in detestation or banished from the city. Surely not. For they taught their art for a good purpose, to be used against enemies and evildoers, in self-defense, not in aggression, and others have perverted their instructions and turned to a bad use their own strength and skill. But not on this account are the teachers bad, neither is the art in fault or bad in itself. I should rather say that those who make a bad use of the art are to blame. And the same argument holds good of rhetoric. For the rhetorician can speak against all men and upon any subject. In short, he can persuade the multitude better than any other man of anything which he pleases, but he should not therefore seek to defraud the physician or any other artist of his reputation, merely because he has the power. He ought to use rhetoric fairly, as he would also use his athletic powers. And if after having become a rhetorician, he makes a bad use of his strength and skill, his instructor surely ought not on that account to be held in detestation or banished. For he was intended by his teacher to make a good use of his instructions, but he abuses them. And therefore he is the person who ought to be held in detestation, banished, and put to death, and not his instructor. So two things here, right? So if a teacher of rhetoric teaches his art to someone who then uses that art for unscrupulous or morally questionable ends, whose fault is Gorgias saying it is?
The students.
That it's entirely on the student, right, to know what to do with the art, right? The art is not to blame, nor is the teacher. The art, for Gorgias, is a morally neutral tool. That can be used for things both either good or bad, right? And all the teacher does is provide the student with that tool. And if the student makes a bad use of it, well, it's the student's own fault, right?
Okay, but like, what about this? So, what if you taught your kid to say a swear word and they go again and get in trouble? What is you to be to blame and not your kid? Because you taught them the swear word?
Well, how many people teach their kids swear words on purpose?
Okay, hypothetically.
I mean, I will be honest, like for a little while, like I was teaching my niece when she was a toddler and learning how to talk. I taught her all these Marxist vocabulary words like commodity fetishism and proletariat, and mostly just because I thought it was funny, and she kind of like list them back in toddler speak, proletariat. And then she started repeating them when my sister would take her like to look for preschools and things like that. Mostly in situations that were embarrassing for my sister. I don't consider myself to blame for it. It was funny.
I would say, wouldn't it be like you because she's young, like she doesn't know to do
Yeah.
that, and you know the meanings, you're going to taught her those words.
Oh, sure, yeah. But I think the other issue here is that Gorgias is also talking about teaching adults, not about teaching children. And adults should already have a sense of right and wrong, right? A sense of what is or is not. You would think.
That's not always the case.
No, it's not. In an ideal world, right? But I think, at the very least, like when you're talking about teaching adults, and again, like we're trying to remember too, the dialogue overall disagrees with Gorgias, right? Plato is on the other side of this. But at least, to be fair to Gorgias' point here, if you are teaching something to an adult who does not yet know the difference between right and wrong, it's questionable whether that's on you, right? Particularly if you don't know. Like, if you think about like the case of, say, somebody like a sociopath, right? Who has no sense of right and wrong, but is very convincing and is very much able to pretend to be socially normal, right? Then, the teacher would have no way of knowing that, in fact, this person's ethics are deficient, right? But where this really sort of comes down for Plato, right, is this whole idea of anything being a morally neutral tool, right? Plato does not believe that anything is morally neutral. Truth is good, and opinion is bad. So for him, anything that leads people away from truth and towards opinion and relativity, or relativism, would be bad, right?
What if they bend the truth?
What's that?
What if they bend the truth to make it what they want it to be?
That's part of the problem, right? So what he's saying is that rhetoric and opinion are always mere shadows of truth, right? That are deceptive, that lead you away from it, right? So any kind of tool that convinces you to adopt an opinion is merely a pale counterfeit of this more useful kind of back and forth discussion in which two people question each other in order to get at the truth, right? Does this make sense? Sort of. So essentially, like what Socrates is trying to do throughout the dialogue is pull the truth out of Gorgias, right? Plato's basic theory of education is that we already know everything due to our experience from past lives. And just bear with me.
Like reincarnation?
Yeah. It was not an uncommon belief in ancient Greece. And that what we need to do is, through questioning, be reminded of the things that we already know and the things that we've already learned, right? So we all already know what the truth is. And in order to access it, we have to engage in discussion, right? We have to engage in this kind of rigorous questioning in order to draw it out of us again. And yeah, it sounds like a weird idea to us, right? But again, like, in Plato's historical moments, these beliefs weren't especially unusual. And yeah, because what Gorgias is doing is guiding people towards adopting particular opinions, rather than engaging in discussion to draw out truth, then what he's doing isn't morally neutral. For Plato, it's out and out evil. So I will post the video of the Aristotle session. You can watch it when you have time. And one thing to note is that Aristotle is Plato's student, but adopts a position that's more similar to Gorgias's. So he is actually kind of like taking the opposite position to the one held by his teacher. All right, so we'll see you on Monday, and I will look over those things that you already turned in, and I'll give you a chance to revise them.